Well, welcome to World War II Part 25. Now, on the last number of parts, in 1942 as my schedule, I have been in the Pacific, okay, but now I'm going to mix it up a bit and jump to the Eastern Front, okay. Now, at the end of 1941, we went through until the end of March time in 1942, okay, when the spring thaw pretty much brought an end to offensive operations on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa had been an enormous success. It had not taken all of its objectives, namely Moscow and Leningrad, but it had taken hundreds of miles and millions of cubic miles of Soviet territory, and it inflicted defeats on the Soviet army that no other army in the world could have survived. But the Russians, okay, with things I've mentioned, like the difficulty of the unusable roads, the winter weather conditions, the vast numbers, the vast distances, just everything about the Russian campaign ultimately denied the Germans their goals, also tied with dogged Russian resistance. And the Russians showed in November with their vast counterattack on the Moscow front after being pushed virtually to Moscow itself. Russian civilians and troops are surrounded in Leningrad. The destruction of the Kiev pocket, the biggest pocket in history, and the ferocity of the Russian counterattack before Moscow that actually nearly punched the German whole apart in a number of places, okay, creating a number of salients. The Russians fought with incredible spirit and determination, mass tank and infantry attacks. The Germans barely held on, but they managed, okay, with clever tactics and, clever strategies to manage to hold the line and keep the Russians partially boxed in. But they did have to give a lot of ground, especially before Moscow. So when we come into the 1942 campaign, okay, there's a big redirect. Now, last year, as I said, two main targets were Leningrad, and Moscow. Neither of those had fallen, okay, but Hitler turned the Wehrmacht's summer campaign in 1942 into a different area. Now, in 1942, it started German summer offensive, okay, and actually it would be the Russians who initiate the summer campaign in Russia. The German army had now swelled to 233 divisions, okay, now that is 25 more than the 208 divisions the German army had in total, including those garrisoning occupied territories. 25 divisions more than they had when Operation Barbarossa was launched. Now, basically, there were a whole number of divisions in other areas. Okay, now in Norway and Denmark, they had 12 divisions in Norway and Denmark instead of the original 8. They'd lowered the number of divisions, okay, in the west, namely France mainly, from 38 divisions down to 26. They'd increased the divisions in the Balkans from 5 to 7, and they'd increased the divisions coming into 1942 in Africa from 2 divisions to 3 divisions, okay. Now, basically, Army Group D in Western Europe had to give up 15 divisions, but did receive 3 Panzer divisions in replacement, and Rundstedt, who took over command of Army Group D from Field Marshal von Witzleben on March 15th, 1942. So therefore, counting all that, okay, the Germans on the Eastern Front had 184 divisions. 5 of those were in the 20th Army in Lapland under the command of Colonel General Dietl, and were controlled by OKW light units in other secondary theatres. OKH's authority covered the other 179 divisions in action, okay, between Gulf of Finland and the Kerch Peninsula in the Crimea. Now, these included 122 infantry divisions, okay, which is 18 more than they had at the start of Barbarossa. They had 1.5 extra mountain divisions, 2 extra light divisions. The number of panzer and motorised divisions was unchanged. They did have another 2 extra SS motorised divisions, and they had 3 extra security divisions. Now, originally in each army group sector, north, centre and south, the Germans created had 3 security divisions. Now, these would handle internal security in the occupied Russian areas. But due to the already stubborn resistance of Russian partisans, the Germans increased it from 3 per sector to 4 per sector. So the Germans were in larger numbers, okay? They also were receiving better equipment. You know, Panzer Mark 3s, okay, were given a 5 centimeter gun, you know, with a 60 caliber barrel length. The Panzer Mark 4 were upgraded to a 7.5 centimeter gun, with giving basically the Panzer 3 and Panzer 4 better armor punching capabilities. You know, the Russians, meanwhile, the Germans, who'd been terrified by the fantastic to watch Katsuya rocket launchers, and when there's a line of them and they're all firing, it is incredible. Now, the Russians at first had the Katsuya rocket launchers, basically, as the Germans called them, Stalin's organs, and, you know, they absolutely terrified the Germans, but the Germans did reply with an additional weapon, okay, which had 6 15-centimeter barrels, okay, arranged hexagonally on a split trail mounting, okay, so it fired salvos of 80-pound rocket shells, a distance of about 7,000 to 8,000 yards, and the Russians on the receiving end found them unpleasantly effective. But basically, even though they were upgrading the tanks, even though they were bringing the first rocket launchers to the front, even though the number of divisions that they had created gave them a larger number than what they had at the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. You know, the Germans were still pretty much outnumbered by the Russians in many areas. Now, the Allied divisions, okay, that went to Russia, that by the end of 1941 included 3 Italian divisions. Hungary had 3 brigades. Romania had 15 divisions, okay. So there were 52 satellite divisions, including the Finns, fighting with Germans at the start of Operation Barbarossa, okay. And just before Stalingrad this year, that number would also be up to 65. The Italians went from 3 divisions to a total of 10 divisions. The Hungarians increased their numbers in Russia from 3 brigades to 10 full divisions, and the Romanians increased their number of troops from 15 divisions to 25 divisions. Okay, now many of these satellite divisions were basically in the southern sector, and their job, okay, with the oncoming German summer offensive plan known as Case Blue, were to basically provide support to the German flanks and provide security in other areas. Okay, they could fight on the front line, but the Germans would prefer their units, their more better hardened, experienced units, to fight in the front line, and the Italians, Romanians, Hungarians would be used, like I said, to protect flanks, to protect key areas, okay, and not much more than that. So basically, there were a total of 215 divisions, 184 German, and 46 Allied divisions in Russia. Okay, 35 more than Operation Barbarossa, a total of 215 divisions. Now, the Russians had also been reorganizing in the Eastern Front. Okay, they were producing many more T-34 tanks now, and they were also producing many more of the KV heavy tanks, which was a formidable battle tank. But the Russian divisions now, pretty much, which at the start of Barbarossa averaged over 20,000 men, the Russian divisions had been shrunk down into units of about 10,000 men, you know, about half what is in a corresponding German division. But the Russians used infantry very differently. Massed attacks, often in conjunction with the tanks. The Russians always suffered heavy casualties, but, you know, when the Russians got it right, they could literally overrun you. Now, basically, the Russians also increased their anti-tank weapons, okay, you know, including 57mm anti-tank guns. The numbers of 57mm anti-tank guns the Russian divisions had were increased, obviously, to deal with the panzers. And the Russians also did an innovation which grouped, okay, a motorized infantry brigade with another to form a tank corps. Okay, so they were reorganizing how they controlled their armor and how they controlled their armor. Now, Hitler's objectives for 1942, okay, were widespread and actually, to me, quite fictitious, okay. Now, in the winter campaign, okay, as it came to an end with the thaw, The German troops had succeeded in scoring incredible victories, but also withstanding, the incredible Russian counterattack, which the Germans never expected. They never expected so many guns, so many tanks, so many planes, and so many men to hit them on the Moscow front in the Russian counterattack. It really did catch them by surprise, because they'd assumed and they were being told that the Russian bear was literally ready to lay down, that, they'd suffered such huge losses their army could not recover, and then the entire Russian Central Front, as well as other areas, came under massed attack. Okay, and it kind of shocked the Germans to a certain extent. Now, Directive number 41, okay, dated 5th of April, set out the Wehrmacht's objectives for 1942 in the Eastern Front. And this is really, really incredible. Now, again, case 41, Directive 41 stated, the enemy has suffered enormous loss of men and material in attempting to exploit their apparent initial success. They've exhausted during this winter the mass of their reserves, which were intended for later operations. Now, obviously, that is proved wrong, because on the southern front, the Russians go over to the offensive first. And it is only the incredible strategies of von Manstein that saves the day. Where he lets the Russian attack, which is punching through the German line, he lets them attack right up until the point they're at the very extent of their supply lanes. Then Manstein counterattacks, and the riposte is devastating to the Russians. So the operation is to be divided into several phases. Okay, Directive 41 now. The left flank of Army Group South, okay, is going to move on from Kursk on the Don to Voronezh, okay, and moving down the river, close a pincer by meeting the 6th Army, which is coming from Kharkov, okay, in the second phase. Now, in the third phase, okay, Field Marshal von Bock's right flank, now commanded by Field Marshal List and renamed Army Group A, would force the Donets in the Voroshilograd area and move up the Don through Rostov to meet the rest of Army Group South, which in the interval would have become Army Group B. Now, this new pincer movement would close on the legendary city of Stalingrad, okay, either taking the city or at least eliminating its industrial base, communication centres, and stopping the flow of supplies from southern Russia coming up that vital Volga corridor. Then, okay, Bock, with his right flank on the Volga and his left in contact with Army Group centred in Kursk area, which of course would come to much more prominence in 1943, would cover Listria, while the latter, reinforced by the 11th Army, okay, after forcing the surrender of Sevastopol and the Kerch Strait, would press forward to invade the Caucasus, okay, the vast area of the Caucasus, which is one of the Russians' main oil-producing regions, as well as a huge grain area. So pressed forward to invade Caucasus. Now, with this aim, okay, the Romanians, Italians and Hungarians will position themselves on the Don between the bend at Kalach and Voronezh area, while the German 2nd and 6th Army on the flanks would be moved to sectors where the defence would have no river obstacle to help them. So basically, the Romanians, Hungarians, Italians would cover the river crossings, secure those areas, and the German armies would move to face the Russians in areas where there are less natural obstacles, when the Germans can use their more vast strategic tactics. So this would be the fourth and final phase of the summer campaign that was intended to win the war in the East for the Third Reich. So was this plan really possible? Okay, now, General Halder noted in his diary, "These people are dreamers on a continental scale. On the basis of their experience at army so far, they readily admit that it depends on our enthusiasm and effort whether the Persian Gulf is to be reached overland through the Caucasus or the Suez Canal from Cyrenia through Egypt. They talk of land operations through Italian East Africa, Abyssinia, of course, where Britain scored many fantastic victories, pretty much annexing the entire area." And after having received his guest for dinner, he concluded with this somewhat sarcastic remark, "Much ado about nothing." So, moreover, before launching Operation Blau, okay, code Blue, the German summer offensive, Directive 41 required Bock to take the last remaining positions in the Crimea and the remaining positions in the irksome Izium salient, carved into German lines on right bank at Donetsk and during the Soviet winter offensive. So basically, the stage is set. Okay, now there are some other things about this that many people may not realize. Okay, the daydream. Now, following this line of attack, okay, to overrun the Caucasus, which is, a very important area. Okay, it is a vital area for Russia, but ultimately, could the Germans ever really have succeeded in doing this? Now, basically, okay, the front, okay, that Army Group A and B had on June 28th was 500 miles, okay? Now, just to give you an idea of how this goes, by July 25th, so less than a month later, if they reach the Voronezh, Rostov, Simlyansk line, okay, their front extends from 500 miles to 750 miles. And if they do reach their objectives of Voronezh, Stalingrad, Astrakhan, Baku, Tbilisi, Batumi, and the Kerch Strait, basically the two German army groups and their allies that form Army Group South would have to extend their front line from a total of 500 miles to 2,500 miles. Now, 1,100 miles of that is coastline of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, but still, that still leaves a front of 1,400 miles, okay? So even if the Germans achieved all their objectives, their front line would be thin, and any major Soviet offensive in any of those areas would probably have been very successful in punching holes in the German line. So the plans of April 5th, okay, when Stalin analysed it, on the German side, they had 6 panzer divisions and 3 motorised divisions from 4th Panzer Army and the German 6th Army, which included many of the best German infantry divisions. So facing this on a 130-mile front on Russian side were the 61st and 62nd Armies of the Stalingrad front, which on July 12th came under Marshal Timoshenko when it's renamed the Southwest Front. Now, according to Great Patriotic War, July 22nd, the 62nd Army had 6 divisions in the line, and the 64th only 2. Okay, so 8 divisions in total. 3 more were moving up quickly by forced marches. But, in that open plain, over that 130-mile front facing the German 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army, they only had 11 divisions. And like I said, those divisions now averaged about 10,000 men each. So the 4th Panzer Army would have no trouble punching through the line. And the massed size of the German 6th Army, obviously would be creating major problems as well. So, the stage is set. The Russians have been working heavily to produce tanks, aircraft equipment. They have been working very hard since the thaw and prior to the thaw during their winter offensive to be ready, okay, to launch their spring, should I call it, offensive on the Eastern Front. Now, the spring offensive by the Russians would start out well and would appear to be going well, okay, until Manstein lured them into a plot, okay, lured them into a trap, okay, and then destroyed a huge bulk of Russian forces, thus tearing a massive set of holes in the Russian line facing Army Group South, which the Germans would take full advantage of, as you can see on the map with their advances through the different stages. They would take an area of land bigger than many European countries, just in that southern sector alone, okay, but they would not achieve all their objectives. So let us now jump back to the Eastern Front. So basically in April on Eastern Front in southern sector, okay, the Russians launch violent counterattacks in area of Kerch in the Crimean Peninsula, but make virtually no progress. German resistance is absolutely fierce, but the counterattack of the spring for the Russians has started. Now in central sector, the Germans are still on defensive following the Russian winter campaign. They start fighting off the Russian thrusts, and in the north, the Russians advance very, very slowly indeed. The Germans are trying, their best to hold them at bay. So in southern sector in Crimea, the Russians tried to land new forces, okay, in the Crimea, but are stubbornly resisted by German defenders. No major action is now taking part in the central front, while in the North, Army Group North is still making slow progress towards their forces cut off in the Kalmar, Staraya, Russia area. That was 5 divisions that were cut off during the Russian counterattack in the Leningrad front. The Germans, even now, after the thaw's kind of coming to an end, they are still trying to reach those beleaguered forces, but it is heavy work against stiff Russian resistance. So basically, we are set. Okay, we are set. Now, on the Eastern Front, like I said, the Russians will walk into a disaster. This will lead through the remainder of the year, okay, and head towards the Battle of Stalingrad itself, which I will, of course, cover as partaking through it, and also the vicious Soviet counteroffensive that would spell the beginning of the end for German forces in the Eastern Front. And it's just interesting that when many people consider the Eastern Front, they fail to, give the German army often much credit for its stubborn resistance, its great tactical skill, because ultimately from 1942 it took the Russians 2.5 to 3 years to pretty much capture back what the Germans had taken in a period of 4 to 5 months. Okay, even later when the Germans were heavily outnumbered, the Russians still found the going tough in many circumstances. It is what it is. But in the Eastern Front, we are about to kick off. Now, Stalingrad, of course, is a very notable battle. It's one of the famous battles of World War II, So the Germans, okay, in early May, they begin a series of attacks, okay, to test the strength of enemy forces in readiness for the large-scale offensive Case Blue, okay, planned for the summer, which is to seize Stalingrad, the Caucasus oil fields, and to solidify a southern front line in preparation for the arrival of winter so they can defend their holdings against Russian attack. Now, the objective, like I said, is the oil fields in the Caucasus. Okay, the 11th Army of Army Group South advances towards Kerch in the Crimea. And pretty much the Russian Front 1942 has begun. So while German Army Group South in May continues its offensive against Kerch, the Russians begin their spring attack, okay, against the German forces in Army Group South. A pincer attack, okay, aiming to take Kharkov, okay, northwards from the Izium salient and southwest across the river Donets. So withdrawal of Russian troops from Kerch Peninsula is ordered by the Russian High Command also in the first few weeks of May 1942. Now, after fierce fighting, okay, Germans retake the town and harbour of Kerch in the Crimea. The Soviet offensive now starts to pick up steam from its initial launch towards the Kharkov area. And German Army Group South, okay, counterattacks against the Izium salient and east of Kharkov, halting the Soviet winter offensive. The fighting grows more bitter. Now, the Germans launch a counteroffensive 80 miles southeast of Kharkov. Now, the battle continues until the end of June, and victory is complete by Erich von Manstein. So, Army Group South strikes hard at Russians in Kharkov area, cutting off part of the enemy forces in the Izium salient west of Donetsk. Really incredible, really, when you think about the German forces. They are so well trained and experienced now, all those campaigns. And even though the Germans have suffered heavy losses, they are still, fantastic forces. Now, the Kharkov battle ends in a brilliant victory for the Germans, who eliminate the area, the enemy salient west of the Donetsk in the area of Kharkov. It really is a stunning victory for the Germans. The Germans ultimately wipe out an entire pretty much Soviet army. Entire groups of Soviet forces are wiped out. 20 infantry divisions, 7 cavalry divisions, and 13 armoured brigades have been wiped out from the Russian forces in the southern sector in this brief attack and counter-attack by von Manstein. The Russians have taken over 200,000 prisoners by the Germans. The Russians also lose over 1,300 tanks and over 2,000 pieces of artillery. The Russians also suffer many more killed, wounded, and missing. The Germans, meanwhile, during this Kharkov campaign, only lose 20,000 troops on the Eastern Front in the area of Kharkov. Now, what this does, okay, this pretty much enables the Germans to make massive holes in the Russian lines. So in southern sector, at the start of June 1942, okay, the 11th Army of Army Group South begins a tremendous artillery barrage lasting 5 days in preparation for the German and Romanian assault on the fortress of Sevastopol in the Crimea, which has been holding out since 1941, and with stubborn resistance, even with special German siege artillery brought up, like the gigantic railway gun, etc., etc., they have held out. Now, Early June, okay, after artillery preparation lasting 5 days, Germans and Romanians launched their final assault on the fortress of Sevastopol in the Crimea. Now, the threat from Sevastopol has to be eliminated before they can go on to capture the Caucasus via Kerch and the Kerch Strait, okay, they cannot leave the Russian forces in their rear. Now, activity in central and northern sectors is limited to minor adjustments of the front lines. This is already clear that from the Russian spring offensive towards Kharkov, the German counterattack, that it's becoming pretty clear already that it is going to be pretty much a Southern Front war in 1942. So the German army group south makes slow progress against Sevastopol defences. The fortress has 7 rifle divisions, 1 cavalry divisions, 2 brigades of infantry and 3 of naval riflemen. They also in Sevastopol have several armoured battalions and other autonomous units, 10 regiments of artillery, 2 mortar battalions, 1 anti-tank regiment and 45 groups of naval guns. Altogether, over 600 artillery pieces, over 100,000 men and over 2,000 mortars. Now on German side, General von Manstein commands a force of 7 divisions, 5 German and 2 Romanian. They too have outstanding artillery support, including mortars and some siege guns of the exceptionally large calibre, like the Kalmar mortar and the giant railway gun. So by mid-June, pretty much, having checked Russian offensive in Kharkov area, the Germans, now go over to the counter-offensive. In course of 3 days, they crush 3 entire Russian armies. Incredible, really. 3 entire Russian armies. Within a few weeks, the Russian counterattack has been held, secured. German counterattack, pretty much 3 Russian armies are wiped out. Incredible victory for the Germans. And for the Germans, this is the perfect way to begin operations on the Eastern Front, with the holes carved in the Russian line from the losses in the doomed Kharkov assault. So the Germans at Sevastopol take Maxim Gorky fort after 11 days of bloody fighting. The Germans are now just 2 miles from Sevastopol harbour. The attack is going well, but the fighting is actually quite fierce. On the Eastern Front, the Germans and Romanians attacking Sevastopol take now the Lenin fort on June 20th and reach the southern bank of the harbour after violent and intense fighting. So basically, also on Eastern Front, on anniversary, German invasion, a review of the first year at war, drawing up the balance sheet is drawn up now. Basically, these figures are ridiculous, they basically make out that the Germans have lost 10 million troops, the Russians 4.5 million. Germany's lost 30,000 guns to Russia's 22,000. Really, really crazy numbers. They make out that Germany has lost 20,000 aircraft to Russia's losses of 9,000. These figures are purely for propaganda. These figures are not intact. Germany at no point in the Second World War even had the Luftwaffe at any level near 20,000 aircraft, in this period. Basically, German losses, in the time, 15th of February, they'd lost 946,000. At 10th of May, those losses had gone to 1.18 million. By June, they'd gone to 1.268 million. By end of June this month, they rose to 1.36 million. And by September, they'd rose to 1.63 million. So it just shows that the Russians playing propaganda to the populace, but really, it's not going to be bought by anybody, really. So in Directive 41, Hitler lays down following campaign, like I've explained: liquidation of Russians in Crimea, which is ongoing, at Sevastopol, capture of Voronezh, so as to threaten both central sector up front and also Stalingrad, encirclement and elimination of Soviet forces in the Great Bend of the Don River, attacking from Voronezh in the north and Taganrog in the south, while the road to Stalingrad would be left open. The capture or destruction of that city, a wheel south at Caucasus to capture Maykop, Grozny and the Baku oil fields, bringing the Germans to the Turkish frontier, which may induce Turks to line up with the Axis. Now, there was a German hope that if they could achieve these aims and force Turkey to sign either a treaty with Germany or actually join the Tripartite Pact, that Turkey could then attack Britain in Syria and other areas. But of course, it did not work out that way, and it did not fully work out that way. So taking a closer look at the fall of Sevastopol, on 7th of June, after the 5-day artillery bombardment, okay, the German and Romanian forces attack. So as I said, fortress has 100,000 troops. Sevastopol is the biggest port on the Black Sea and is surrounded by a triple defence line. The first of trenches and minefields, the second a series of forts between Belbak Valley and the Gulf of Savania. Forts which the Germans have given names to, like Stalin, Molotov, Volga and Gepau, Siberia. Biggest of all, Maxim Gorky 1 and Maxim Gorky 2. Those forts are armed and protected by 305mm guns and have huge concrete walls. The third defensive line is just outside the city and consists of trenches, gun positions and machine gun positions. And like I said, they had 600 guns and over 2,000 mortars. The Germans, meanwhile, though, bought Big Bertha, okay, a huge mortar that had a caliber of 420 millimeters. The Gamma's caliber, coming in at 427 millimeters, has a range of 8.7 miles. Its projectile weighs nearly a ton at 2,000 pounds. The barrel is 22 feet long, and it needs a crew of 235 men to operate it. Now, besides the Gamma, there's also the Karl, okay, a huge mortar which has already been used at Brest-Litovsk. It's specifically designed for use against reinforced concrete fortifications. Now, the Karl mortar, whereas the Big Bertha mortar, the Gamma, came in at 427mm, the Karl mortar has a millimeter barrel of 615 millimeters, ridiculously huge. The length of its barrel is just over 16 feet, and the projectile that the Karl fires, the mortar fires, is over 2 tons at over 4,800 pounds. Then there's Dora, okay, also called Big Gustav, a gun that can fire 3 projectiles an hour, a real monster of artillery which no reinforced concrete can resist. Dora has a caliber barrel of 800 meters, a barrel 106 feet long, and a shell. The shell itself is 25 feet long. It weighs over 4 tons, approaching 5 tons at 9,900 pounds, and has a devastating range of 28 miles. There are at least 4,120 men concerned with Dora's operation. Just to aim, load, fire the weapon takes a crew of 1,500 men, commanded by a brigadier and a colonel. But a single shell from Dora at Sevastopol in the Gulf of Savania has destroyed an ammunition dump that was 100 feet underground. So one shot from the big railway gun Dora, with its near 5-ton shell, basically destroyed an ammunition dump 100 feet underground. That is how devastating that weapon was. The German and Romanian infantry go into attack at 3:50 a.m. on the 7th of June and are met by a tremendous barrage of artillery and mortars from the Russians. So by 13th of June, okay, 6 days after the initial barrage begun, Fort Stalin falls after a day's savage fighting by attackers and defenders. Then from 14th to 17th of June, Germans and Romanians continue with fierce attacks on the second line of fortifications. The defenders are winkled out at Fort Siberia with flamethrowers or burnt to death inside their fortifications. On the 18th of June, Germans take Forts Gepau, Molotov, Cheka, Volga and Urals, and after a long struggle, okay, marked by superhuman tenacity and heroism on both sides, they capture the dreaded Maxim Gorky 1, one of the biggest forts in the fortress at Sevastopol. 2 days later, the Germans take Fort Lenin. The Russians are fighting stubbornly for every inch of ground. The Romanians are no less courageous than Germans, though, and the Romanians show, at Sevastopol that they are just as brave as any Russian or German unit. The Romanians fight very well. They do not fight as well later against the Russian mass tank attacks, as we will see in the Russian winter counter-offensive of 1942, which we will cover at that time. But the Russians, in their desperate defence, put all available personnel in front line, including reservists and even boys. So on June 27th, okay, after 3 weeks of fierce fighting since June 7th, Sevastopol has virtually fallen. Small pockets of resistance continue to hold up until July 3rd, before the last of those are actually wiped out. But pretty much over the span of a few weeks, Sevastopol has fallen. Now, Russians hold the Germans up at Voronezh, but are giving way quickly in southern front at Rostov. So Hitler decides to make some far-reaching changes in strategy. Now he wants to carry out the taking of Stalingrad and the conquest of the Caucasus at the same time. Now originally, as I said, if you remember, the Germans were to pinwheel on Voronezh, extend down and take Stalingrad, solidify the front, and then go into the Caucasus. But Hitler makes this desperate blunder, okay, by suddenly saying, no, we must do all of them at the same time, which results in the German forces on Stalingrad front, albeit powerful, being then having units stripped away from its flanks to go into the Caucasus, which is not the best thing. Now, as Zhukov said later, this was a monstrous error, pregnant with disastrous consequences for the Wehrmacht, as Zhukov famously quoted. So Army Group South opens a limited offensive, towards, on the anniversary of Barbarossa, 22nd of June 1942, Army Group South attacks in the Izium sector to improve German positions east of the Donets in preparation for a great offensive that is to be launched as soon as Sevastopol is taken, and the Germans do immediately go over to the offensive at that point. And this is ultimately what the Germans are waiting for. They're waiting for Sevastopol to fall so then they can go full scale. So on the Eastern Front, Army Group South reaches the line of the River Oskol, the objective set to it by the headquarters in the Izium area. The battle still rages at Sevastopol, but the end is in sight. Now on June 25th, 1942, now that threat from Sevastopol to right flank is virtually eliminated, the Germans go over to the offensive. Case Blue is fully launched in full. The Germans attack along the southern sector with nearly 40 divisions moving from the Kursk sector in the direction of Voronezh. Now the Russians evacuate Kupiansk, southeast of Kharkov, under the huge German attack. Now on 26th of June, a major victory is scored by the German 6th Army under General von Paulus at Kharkov on the Donets. Further south, Army Group South retakes the area of Rostov on Don. The Germans established several bridgeheads over the Don River. A gap is being opened in Russian lines in the central sector. In the northern sector too, Germans have regained the initiative, so long held by the Russians since the beginning of the Russian winter campaign in November 1941, but now the Germans have re-established control in the Voronezh sector as well. So towards the end of June, Germans step up their offensive in all sectors. They launch an offensive at Kursk, and in the northern sector they gain an important victory crossing the river Volkhov and eliminating a Soviet salient in that area. So the Germans have finally gone over to the full offensive. The Germans step up in southern sector. German 2nd Army and the 4th Panzer Group attack towards Voronezh, while the 6th Army pushes on eastwards in region southeast of Belgorod. In the Crimea, the battle for Sevastopol is virtually over, just those few pockets left I mentioned. Meanwhile, Army Group North eliminates the Russian pocket of resistance west of the river Volkhov. Hitler's headquarters announces on July 1st Sevastopol is in German hands. Just a few pockets to clean up. Army Group Centre continues its advance into the Don industrial basin. So we are off heading through the Case Blue summer offensive. Now all the organised Russian resistance in the Crimea has ceased by July 5th. The 4th Panzer Group reaches the Don in the area of Voronezh, already meeting bitter resistance from Russian forces. In central sector, the Germans moved to better positions in the Smolensk area to solidify their lines. In the 6th of July, the German 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Group moved towards Voronezh from the west and southeast. German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Group join up finally northeast of Valyuki. The Germans take Voronezh, but the Russians hold up the Germans by a violent counterattack just east of the town of Voronezh. Meanwhile, other units of Army Group South continue with destruction of the Russian forces in the Don basin. So the Germans are already having marked success, and the Germans will cover ground in 1942 of huge amount. So on July 9th, the Army Group South is divided into two groups, as I mentioned briefly prior. Army Group A in the south is made up of 1st Armoured Army and the 11th and 17th Armies, and Army Group B in north, is made up of the German 2nd Army, the Hungarian 2nd Army, the 4th Armoured Army, formerly the 4th Panzer Group, and the German 6th Army. So Army Group A is to retake Rostov-on-Don, where the largest enemy forces are thought to be concentrated, then advance south towards the Caucasus. Army Group B is to advance along the Don as far as Stalingrad, and then along the Volga towards Astrakhan. So the German 4th Armoured Army joins up with the 6th Army advancing along the Don towards Stalingrad, while the 1st Armoured Army and 17th Army of Army Group A press on in the direction of Rostov. The Russians admit the loss of Rosso and also admit considerable German forces are on the east bank of the Don. So, the OKW of German military command announces that between June 28th and July 9th, German troops have broken through enemy lines beyond Kharkov and Kursk, pushing on towards Rostov. Army Group A takes Lysychansk on the Donetsk basin area. And the Russians, meanwhile, on the 12th of July, established the Stalingrad front under the command of Marshal Timoshenko. Now, Moscow sources state that the Don is running with blood. But sadly, it's not running with too much German blood. Meanwhile, Army Group B and Army Group A make progress swiftly towards Stalingrad and the other towards Rostov. The 4th Armoured Army is transferred from Army Group B to Army Group A to join in operations south of Rostov. So there we will leave it. When we come back, we will delve further into Eastern Front 1942. I'm out.